Hi everyone, I'm Barbara Levin, Director of Allocations, Grants and Governance at the Jewish Federation of Broward County. Welcome and thank you for coming. I'd like to talk about how you find funding for your security upgrades. Since most of you won't have an extra $100,000 just sitting around in your bank account, that's really important. Let's take a look at this PowerPoint presentation, if you don't mind. Okay, so we're going to be talking about strengthening security and how to find funding to do it. There are several places you might look depending upon what you want to do and the sort of organization you're representing. First of all, the largest funding is from the federal government through the Nonprofit Security Grant Program. We're going to talk a lot about that in a few minutes. Also important, however, is state funding through legislative appropriations. Grant applications that you can make to foundations, individual donors, designated gifts, fees, and of course you can pull funds from your general budget. If you happen to be a Jewish day school or preschool in Broward County, the Florida legislature has set aside funding for you in previous years, and we anticipate they will again. It's important to note that this funding is for Jewish day schools and Jewish full-time preschools. It does not include Hebrew schools and Sunday schools, and it does not include daycares or part-time preschools. If you fall into this category, you'll be contacted within the next few months. If you have questions, please direct them to Mimi Dankovitz, and here's her contact information. If you are going to apply through that process, it's a very, very simple application process. The funding is simply based on the number of your enrolled students. One caveat, please submit really accurate enrollment numbers because they will check and they get kind of angry if they find out that the numbers weren't quite kosher. You're also going to have to submit a certification of legitimate concern from a group or groups on the U.S. State Department terrorist watch list. You'll also have to submit confirmation that you plan to apply for funding to the Florida Department of Education by the required date. Now, getting to the major source of funding, the Nonprofit Security Grant Program. It's issued by the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, the Grant Programs Directorate. This program seeks to integrate the preparedness activities of nonprofit organizations that are particularly high risk of terrorist attack with the broader state and local preparedness efforts. They're the largest source of funding for nonprofit security upgrades. This year, they gave $90 million to support target hardening and physical security enhancements for nonprofits at high risk of terrorist attack. That was mostly, but not exclusively, Jewish groups. This year, it was up to $100,000 per recipient. Last year, it was $100,000. The year before that, it was $150,000, and the year before that, it was $75,000. So you'll note the amounts do change year to year. If you have any questions at all, you should reach out to Felicia Pinnock, who's the program manager. You should definitely make sure you're on her list of people to contact. If you're not absolutely sure that you're on her list, get a hold of her and ask her to place you on the list. One thing I'm asked by many people is, what are our chances of getting funded, and is it worth the aggravation of applying? The fact is, I can't tell you if you'll be funded. Realistically, there are appointees of an organization called UASI that reviews your application and makes recommendations. Those folks are located in Florida. As far as we can see, the federal government pretty much rubber stamps their recommendations. So those decisions appear to be made in Florida. Their priorities do change year to year, and they do differ state to state. Until last year, schools in Florida didn't seem to be receiving funding at all. Last year, some schools did receive funding. So now it does look like it's worth applying if you're a school. If you or the agency you represent have not received funding previously, you get extra points. You can use the funding towards acquisition and installation of security equipment to protect against terrorist attacks, for training, for planning, or for security guards. Security guards were not allowable until last year, but starting last year, they were. There's some challenges and considerations. It is an extremely competitive process. Funds are limited, not everyone will be funded. That's why you really need to write your very, very best proposal. It's an extremely short application period. Actually, it's a ridiculously short application period. Typically speaking, you're getting only a week to 3 weeks to do the entire application. It's not supposed to be that way, but that's the reality. By the time the announcement is made, it's realistically too late to start. Another important consideration is you have to be able to cover the cost of projects that exceed the amount you're awarded. And keep in mind, current expenses are ineligible. It has to be something new. There's also some project management concerns. It is actually extremely time-consuming to manage most of the work that's done, particularly if you have to hire multiple contractors to do your work. If you only hire one, they might kind of do some of the management themselves. But if you're hiring multiple contractors, it's going to be a bear to manage. So here's some things to consider. Project management can be intense and time-consuming. Do you have the time to do it? And if you don't, who's going to do it? Many of you can't find 500 hours extra to manage it. So really think about who's going to do this. Environmental and historical preservation screening forms must be submitted. You're going to have to submit photos of where you're placing anything you're purchasing. Like if you're putting cameras all around your property, you're going to need a photo of each spot. You're going to also need to submit schematics. You're going to need to get 3 estimates for each item you want to purchase, and you're going to need to submit them. You don't have to choose the cheapest vendor, but you do have to justify why you chose the vendor you did. For instance, maybe your vendor wasn't the cheapest, but he was by far the best. Maybe he had the best ratings. Maybe he's easier to work with, but you're going to need to justify it. You're going to need to submit non-debarment forms from every vendor you use. I'm suggesting that when you get a vendor to come in and give you an estimate, you have him sign a non-debarment form at the very same time so you don't have to chase him down later. You're also going to need to submit quarterly reports, even if you haven't done anything that quarter. You have to wait till you can start on your project. It's not like you can submit your request and just immediately start. You can't start until you're notified that you've been awarded the contract. You can't start until your contract has been signed by both parties, until you've completed your environmental and historic preservation screening forms, until you've sent in all your photos and schematics, and until you've gotten your estimates and sent them in. And then, importantly, you can't start until they give you the go-ahead to start. That will take several months. Here's some things to do before the RFA is even issued. I'm highly recommending you do them now. You will not have time to do them if you wait until the RFA is issued. If you don't have a DUNS number or you're not sure, get one now. It's free. Just go to this site. Register with sam.gov. It's free, but it can take a solid month until you get your registration active, so do it ahead of time. Create a grants.gov account. Here's another important one. Get on Rob Goldberg's email list. Here's his address, his email address. He will send you incredibly important information. You want to get it. And you want to get it before you even apply for a grant. So get on it now. And you want to arrange for a risk assessment. Consider, how are you going to harden your site? That's the terminology they use, is harden it against terrorist attacks. What specifically do you want to add, buy, change, install, or upgrade to make your institution more secure? Work with Mitch Tapper, our security director, to find solutions. I'm giving you the address of the authorized equipment list. Only certain things are going to be allowable expenses, and you're going to need their codes. This is where you look. One caveat, that list is for all the different grants that are out there, not just for this. So only certain pages of it will be allowable for this particular grant. And importantly, consider how will you pay costs that exceed the amount you receive. Often, whatever you plan has cost overruns, and you're going to need to know that you can cover those cost overruns when they happen. Have a risk assessment done early. A terrorism vulnerability assessment looks at the risks. It examines the threats to a specific organization. It documents the gaps in physical security and in security policies and procedures. It details the potential consequences of a terrorist attack. Most importantly, it will recommend specific steps to mitigate the threats. Risk assessments can be done by your local police department, which is free, but call early because if you wait to the end, they won't have time. It can be done by private security firms with special expertise. They might get you more specific suggestions, but they will charge you. And it can be done by the Department of Homeland Security, which is also free, but they really may not have time. So whatever you choose, do it early. Start putting together information about the threats to use in your proposal. That can actually take more time than you think. I'd suggest starting with the threat compendium that's prepared by Rob Goldberg, who is JFNA's Senior Legislative Director. It's very thorough and very good. You can also go to the Southern Poverty Law Center. They have new listings. So check them out, see what's most up to date. The ADL has an audit of anti-Semitic incidents that they update each and every year. You can look at the local and national news. You can ask your local police for a police report. And do not overlook looking at your own agency's record of incidents. Consider what those incidents mean. If you feel that somebody's been sort of staking out your property and looking when you can't figure out why they're there, that might be something you want to talk about. If you've had bomb threats, something you want to talk about. Preparing your investment justification. Biggest suggestion I can make to you is consider pre-writing almost the entire thing on last year's form. True, the form may change a little, but it won't change that much. If you do everything ahead of time, you can tweak a little bit and you'll be ready to go, and you won't find yourself with so little time that you can't get it done. Here's some questions you should ask yourself. Basically, why should they choose to fund you? Consider pretty much everyone applying for this, well, not everyone, but almost everyone, is going to be a Jewish agency. Why should they fund you instead of them? And it is an instead of. Here's 4 things that you could potentially say, assuming they're true. First, your institution is more of a target. If you say that, you're going to have to tell me why. You could say you're more easily recognizable. You could say you're more vulnerable. Or you could tell them that there will be greater repercussions if your organization were hit. Okay, first, why is your institution at risk? First of all, you want to show a pattern of threats. I would personally start from the wider and work into the narrower, that is, to your own institution. But if you have to choose where to put the emphasis, put it on your own. You can talk about Jewish institutions worldwide, nationally, in our state, and locally. But the fact of the matter is, every Jewish institution can say, all the Jewish institutions in the world are at risk. Whatever you can say about your institution specifically, do. And remember, what we're focusing on is terrorism threats, not ordinary crime. If you're saying you've had petty theft on your property, that doesn't necessarily make you more at risk, unless you're saying that the fact that criminals were able to get onto your property means terrorists could also get on. List your specific vulnerabilities. First of all, are you an easily recognized Jewish agency? Do you maybe have a huge sign on your property? Maybe you fly a large Israeli flag. Do you have extensive traffic in or around you that makes many people see you each day and be aware of your presence and maybe gives them easier access? Is there easier access to your building or campus? Maybe you don't have a much needed fence around you. Maybe you have wooded areas behind you that someone could come easily on without being seen. Are you attended by individuals who be particularly targeted? Do you, for instance, have well-known Jewish politicians attending your organization? Do you have vulnerable individuals who would make evacuation difficult? And are there gaps in the current security system? Talk about the potential consequences too. What would the scale of loss of life potentially be? If you have hundreds of people on your campus, there's a lot of potential for people being killed. What's the potential for injuries? What property damage? Would an attack on you shut down critical services? And what would those critical services be? If we shut you down, would people in the community find that they didn't have daycare services, for instance, and not be able to go to work? Would your community be particularly traumatized? You have particularly vulnerable members going. Maybe you have a lot of survivors that attend who would really be traumatized. Would an attack on your organization make our community fearful to exercise our American rights of freedom of religion, freedom to gather, etc.? If you were attacked, would it be easily exploitable by a terrorist group to recruit other terrorists? What's the symbolic value of your site? Is it the largest, the oldest, the most easily recognized? Are you historic? Are you visibly connected to Israel? What would the impact on our community be? Describe your potential role in responding to a terrorist attack or other crises in our community. Have you helped in the past or helped in a recovery following attacks or crises? How did you do that? Would you be critical to responding to an attack or help in the recovery following an attack? How would you do that? For instance, if there was a major attack in our community, would you invite people in to sleep on the floor of your auditorium if they lost their homes? Would you open your daycare center to take care of the children of policemen and firemen who needed to respond to the crisis? What critical infrastructure or services would our community lose that would make our community recovery more difficult and longer if your organization was hit? Managing the project. Consider, if you get funding, who will manage the project? And how will they manage the project? What will your measurable outputs and outcomes be? That means you have to be really specific. So if you say we're going to put a fence around the property, well, that's pretty simple. The output will be there's a fence, and the outcome will be your community, your members are safer. But it might be harder to think of what that is for some other things. Maybe you're going to put lighting on your property. Well, the output might be that you have 50 new lights put on your property, and the outcome might be that there won't be dark shaded areas where terrorists could easily come in unseen, and therefore your community will be safer. But think that through. What would a reasonable timeline be? Quick heads up, they're not going to give you permission to start as soon as the contract comes through. It's going to be months, so take that into consideration. On the other hand, I'm pointing out that it's not that easy, it's not that difficult to move the timeline back. Will you be able to get the permits you need? And what will you do if you can't get those permits? It has been an issue. We've had cities, townships that simply have not given permits for what we've asked for. What will you do? Will you be able to change things? Do you have a way of getting those permits? How will you move forward? What will the likely challenges be, and how will you address those challenges? I assure you, there will be challenges, so think about them ahead of time. Minimally speaking, we tend to have hurricane season here in Florida. What will you do if you're in the middle of a project and we have really bad weather? but think those through ahead of time. So I'm going to move on to another topic, if you don't mind. I want to talk about preparing for the economic consequences of hurricanes and natural disasters. Now, that's not what we usually think about as security issues, but the fact of the matter is it's a real issue for us, and we are in the middle of hurricane season, so I do want to mention it just for a moment. What I want to tell you about that is hurricanes and disasters can be really, really expensive. We've been hit by them before. Many of you are aware of that. The thing to know is, if you prepare ahead, FEMA might be willing to cover the cost, or rather, they might be willing to reimburse you for the cost of many of your expenses. It is time consuming, it's challenging. Many of our organizations didn't feel they were up to doing it themselves. Some agencies partnered with the Federation to have us do it on their behalf. If you're thinking about doing that, consider signing a memorandum of agreement with us ahead of time so that we can work on that for you. So here's some limitations and concerns about that. To obtain reimbursement of expenses related to damage to your building, you would first have to apply for a small business loan. And that you would have to eventually repay. So many people aren't that interested in that part of it. However, there are many things FEMA will directly reimburse you for without doing that. That includes things having to do with preparing ahead so that you don't get damaged and cleaning up your property afterwards. The big thing to consider is if you plan to apply for reimbursement, you need to do intense record keeping from the very get-go. Track all storm-related costs, including the ones before, while you prepare for it, during it, and afterwards. Keep all receipts, and I really mean every single rinky-dinky receipt you could possibly get. Separate items having to do with your facility from those having to do with cleaning up outside. Chances are they're not going to cover your facility, but they will cover outside, so keep the bills separate, but keep everything just in case. Keep the names and the contact information for all contractors. Track the hours worked, the amount paid, etc. Also, I don't have it written here, but just like we suggested you have non-debarment forms signed by every contractor when you first meet them, do that with this too. Have them sign a non-debarment form before you give them their money, and you won't have to track them down later. Track their hours worked, the amount paid for them, and everything you can. For your own staff, track overtime to prep or to clean up after the storm. FEMA is not going to pay for your regular hours, but they might reimburse you for any extra hours. Detailed records really pay off in this situation. Track your generator costs. Keep detailed information about the cleanup of downed trees, vegetation, and other debris on your property. Know the dates, the cubic yards of debris removed, what was removed, how it was disposed of, and where it was taken. Take photos, track the locations of trees and stumps removed. Get the landfill information, the name of the landfill, get the landfill ticket, and the permit number. That sounds ridiculous, but that is literally what they asked for last time around. We did reimbursement for Hurricane Irma related expenses. We were very successful, but they literally asked me for the actual ticket to the landfill and the permit number. So just really, really keep everything. Track the food that was lost due to loss of electricity. Keep receipts for the food purchased before and after the storm. If there's a storm coming and you, for instance, buy food for your students and you keep it in a refrigerator in the school, and you know there's a possibility if you lost electricity that you would lose that, keep the receipts from the food you bought for weeks ahead of time, and keep the receipts for the food you replaced it with. Track your costs to serve the community. That could be the cost of food, water, ice, or other supplies that you purchase to distribute. Track the cost of providing shelter. However, I'm going to tell you, in order to provide shelter, you need to have a prior contract. So you're going to have to look into that ahead of time if you plan to do it. Track your transportation costs. Maybe for delivering food, for instance. Track personnel costs. By the way, I'm going to just go back to that for a moment. I'm just reminding you, if you do hire someone to do work at the last minute, a lot of times it's very hard to find somebody who can do work right after a storm. Whoever you get a first name, a last name, try to get their social security number, get them to sign those forms. You're going to have, and try to pay with a check or something, not with cash. And I'm going to end up by telling you there are other places that you can search for funding. One of the places you should consider is grant funding opportunities. You can look at family foundations, local foundations. You can go to the bigger foundations. There's corporate opportunities. Any corporation that has a location in our state, look on their website, see if they do corporate giving. There's local, state, and government opportunities. But you'll notice at the bottom, I have really, really big written, relationships, relationships, relationships. Even if it's a foundation, knowing somebody on their board is really important. Make relationships ahead of time and check and see if anybody on your board knows anyone on their board. And finally, the Federation is here to help you. If you have questions, here's my contact information. It's Barbara Levin, blevin@jewishbroward.org, 954-252-6970. And I'll also put in a quick plug for our panel discussion on Thursday. Please join us, and we'd be happy to give you more information. Good luck. Let's make our community secure, and I hope to help you find the resources you need to do that. Thank you.